Now that we've looked at declaring elements with schema, let's take a look at how we would declare attributes with schema. Like elements, attributes are declared using their own element in schema, and that happens to be the attribute tag. Attributes, unlike elements, are always simple types. There's no complex types for attributes in schema. Any of the simple types that you saw in the earlier tables that I showed can be used for elements, can also be used for attributes. So recall from that table, we had values like string and Boolean and date and URI and so on. And any of those types you can also use in attribute declarations. So here's a simple example. This tag declares an attribute named age, and its type is an integer. And in addition to the name and the type, you can place an attribute called use on your attribute. Use can have one of three values. It can be optional, in which case the attribute can be either included or omitted. It can be required, which means the attribute has to be there, otherwise it's an error. And then there's another value you can use, which is prohibited, which means that the attribute can explicitly not be used in the XML data. In addition, you can use attributes called default and fixed, and they both mean the same thing. In this example, you see I've modified the age attribute from the example above, and here I've declared that its use is optional and that its default value is 20. I could also replace that attribute default with the name fixed, and it would mean the same thing. Now, since they mean the same thing, you can't have both default and fixed attribute on your definition. You've got to choose one or the other, otherwise that's an error. We can add attributes to a variety of element types, and in this example, we'll take a look at adding an attribute to an element that only has character data content. Recall from earlier section where we talked about declaring elements. In this case, I've got an element named name, and inside the name declaration for the element, I've got a complex type, and I'm using the mixed equals true attribute. Recall from earlier that means that the element can have mixed content. However, since I'm not declaring any elements inside the complex type, that means that the content for this element can only be character data, because I haven't declared any elements that can go inside here. Any element that would appear here in the XML data would now be an error. So continuing that theme, let's look at adding an attribute to an element that has an empty content model. Now in this case, it's pretty much the same as the previous one, only I've just removed the mixed equals true attribute. Here I have an element named image, and inside my complex type definition, I've got an attribute named source, and it's a string type. But since I've removed the mixed equals true attribute from the complex type, now the element is empty. It doesn't have any content whatsoever inside of it, and it only has one attribute. You can also add attributes to elements that have element or mixed content models. So let's see an example of that. So here I have an element, and its name is car. And inside the declaration for this car element, I've got a complex type, and it's a sequence. And the car element is going to have two other elements inside of it, make and model, and those are both strings. After the sequence is where I declare the attribute, and that attribute here is named year, and its type is a Gregorian year specification. Now, this is an important point. The attribute declaration has to go after any of your sequence or choice or all definitions inside your type. If you recall back to the element part of this chapter, we talked about how to declare elements that have certain types of sequences or choices inside them. And attribute definitions have to go after those tags. Okay, so now that we've seen how to declare elements and attributes, let's take a look at using schema on our business card file.